That.
Can't be my bride.
The telegram promised a sturdy widow with childbearing hips and a face meant for churning butter, not turning heads. So, when the mud-spattered Concord coach groaned to a halt in the Wyoming dirt, Clement Montgomery rubbed his scarred jaw. The creature descending the steps in Parisian silk wasn't just trouble, she was a lie. The town of Bitter Creek wasn't much more than a jagged scar of civilization cut into the foothills of the Absaroka Range. It boasted a mercantile, a saloon that smelled of stale beer and desperation, and a stagecoach relay station run by a one-eyed man named Henderson. Clement Montgomery stood on the boardwalk, his broad shoulders casting a long shadow in the brutal afternoon sun. At 34, Clement was a man carved from the very mountains he inhabited. His face was weathered leather, marked by a jagged white scar that ran from his left temple down to his jaw, a lingering souvenir from the bloody woods of Shiloh. He had retreated to the high country to escape the noise of a broken nation, finding solace in the brutal, honest silence of the Wyoming Territory. But a man, no matter how solitary, eventually realizes the winter nights are too long and the silence too deafening to endure entirely alone. He hadn't asked for love. He had placed an advertisement in the Matrimonial Times out of Boston, seeking a practical partnership, wanted, a woman of strong constitution and pragmatic mind for a mountain homestead. No romantics, must know how to survive a winter and shoot straight. He had exchanged 4 letters with a Mrs. Josephine Wright of Philadelphia. Her letters were wonderfully devoid of poetry. She wrote of her ability to stretch a sack of flour, her experience in mending heavy wool, and her desire for a quiet life after burying a husband who had drank himself to an early grave. She had sent a tin-type photograph of a woman with a face like a dropped pie, square-jawed and stern. Perfect, Clement had thought. A woman who wouldn't distract him, who wouldn't expect courtly romance. The heavy rumble of the Concord stagecoach broke his reverie. 6 lathered horses dragged the heavy timber and leather carriage through the alkali dust, pulling up to the station with a squeal of brakes. "She's here, Clement," Old Man Henderson rasped from the doorway of the station, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. Hope she brought her own snowshoes. Clement didn't smile. He stepped off the boardwalk, the silver spurs on his boots chiming softly, his hand resting instinctively near the heavy bone handle of the Colt, .45 at his hip. The stagecoach door swung open. A cloud of fine brown dust settled, and a booted foot appeared on the iron step. But it wasn't a sturdy leather work boot. It was a delicate, polished boot of soft black kidskin, adorned with mother-of-pearl buttons. Clement froze. "That can't be my bride," he muttered under his breath. A woman stepped down into the unforgiving Wyoming sunlight, and the entire dusty street seemed to hold its breath. She was wearing a traveling suit of deep navy silk, tailored so impeccably it clung to a figure that had absolutely no business being in Bitter Creek. A matching hat sat atop a wealth of rich, auburn hair that caught the sunlight like polished mahogany. But it was her face that made Clement's stomach drop. She possessed a devastating, aristocratic beauty, high cheekbones, a straight, proud nose, and eyes the color of shattered emeralds. She looked around the wretched little town with a mixture of veiled horror and desperate resolve. Then, her piercing green eyes landed on Clement. She took a step forward, the silk of her dress whispering against the harsh grit of the street. "Mr. Montgomery?" Her voice was velvet, laced with the refined, clipped vowels of the East Coast elite. Clement stood his ground, towering over her. "I am, but you sure as hell ain't Josephine Wright." The woman didn't flinch. She tilted her chin up. "I am she. And you, I presume, are the man who promised me a homestead." "The Josephine Wright I corresponded with," Clement said, his voice a low, dangerous gravel, sent a photograph of a woman who looked like she could pull a plow if the mule died. "You look like you'd shatter if the wind blew too hard." A momentary flash of panic crossed her emerald eyes, but she masked it quickly with a cool smile. "A woman traveling alone across the country cannot be too careful, Mr. Montgomery. The photograph I sent was of my late husband's spinster aunt. I needed to know you were a man of substance, seeking a partner for my character, not a man looking for a pretty face to adorn his parlor." It was a smooth lie. Too smooth. Clement narrowed his eyes, taking in her unblemished alabaster skin and the delicate, uncalloused hands gripping a silver-clasped reticule. "Your character?" he repeated slowly. "Ma'am, those hands ain't never washed a cast-iron skillet, let alone skinned a buck. People can learn, Mr. Montgomery." "Not up where I live. They don't. Up there, if you don't already know, you freeze, or you starve." Clement tipped his hat back. "The stage leaves back for Cheyenne at dawn. I'll pay Old Man Henderson to put you up in the back room for the night. Go back to whatever fancy parlor you ran away from." He turned on his heel to walk away, fully intending to leave her there in her silk and lies. "Wait!" Her voice lost its refined composure, cracking with sudden, raw panic. Clement stopped, looking back over his shoulder. The proud aristocratic facade had crumbled. Her hands were trembling, gripping the reticule so tightly her knuckles were white. "Please," she whispered, stepping closer so the gathered gawkers couldn't hear. "I cannot go back. If I go back on that stage, I am dead. You gave your word, Clement Montgomery. You signed a contract before God and the law of this territory." Clement looked at her. He saw the genuine, unadulterated terror in her eyes. It was a look he recognized from the war, the look of a cornered animal staring down the barrel of a musket. Whoever she was, whatever she had done, the fear was real. He let out a long, heavy sigh that seemed to drain the energy right out of him. He looked at the heavy leather trunk the stage driver had unceremoniously dumped in the dust. "Henderson," Clement barked, "help me load this trunk into the buckboard." He turned back to the woman. "I don't know who you are, and I know you ain't Josephine. But if someone's gunning for you, they won't follow you up the mountain. Come on. But I'm telling you right now, you're going to wish you stayed in the dirt down here." The journey up into the Absarokas was a brutal, bone-rattling affair. Clement drove the team of sturdy mules with practiced ease, navigating the treacherous switchbacks that hugged the sheer cliff faces. Beside him on the unforgiving wooden seat of the buckboard, the woman who called herself Josephine sat in agonizing silence. The altitude was dropping the temperature by the minute, and the thin navy silk of her dress was no match for the biting mountain wind. Clement watched from the corner of his eye as she shivered violently, her lips turning a faint shade of blue, but she uttered not a single word of complaint. Stubborn, Clement thought. I'll give her that. He reached behind the seat, grabbed a heavy, oil-stained buffalo robe, and dropped it unceremoniously into her lap. She looked at the rough fur, then at him. "Thank you," she murmured, wrapping the heavy hide around her slender shoulders. She looked utterly swallowed by it, a delicate porcelain doll wrapped in a bearskin. "We have another 2 hours," Clement said, keeping his eyes on the trail. "Might as well tell me your real name." "I told you. If you say Josephine Wright one more time, I'm turning this wagon around and dumping you in the canyon," Clement interrupted, his voice flat and devoid of humor. "You smell like French perfume, your clothes cost more than this wagon and the mules combined, and your trunk took 2 grown men to lift. Now, I'm offering you sanctuary, but I ain't offering to be played for a fool." She fell silent for a long time. The only sounds were the crunch of the iron-rimmed wheels on the gravel and the steady, labored breathing of the mules. "Genevieve," she finally whispered to the wind. "My name is Genevieve." "Genevieve what?" "Just Genevieve. For now. Please, Mr. Montgomery. The less you know, the safer you are." Clement let out a dry, humorless chuckle. "Lady, out here, the only thing that keeps me safe is my Winchester and knowing exactly what kind of trouble is standing in my yard. But keep your secrets. For now." The sun was dipping below the jagged peaks, bleeding red and violet across the sky by the time they reached the roost. Clement's homestead sat in a small clearing surrounded by towering lodgepole pines. The cabin itself was a fortress, built of massive, unpeeled logs, its roof heavy with sod. It was practical, formidable, and entirely unwelcoming to a woman used to drawing rooms. Clement halted the mules and hopped down. He didn't offer her a hand. He wanted to see what she would do. Genevieve struggled with the heavy buffalo robe, her legs stiff from the cold and the ride. She clumsily navigated the wheel hub and dropped to the dirt, nearly losing her footing. "Go inside," Clement pointed to the heavy oak door. "There's matches on the table, wood in the box. Get the stove going. I'll unhitch the team and bring your trunk." Genevieve nodded, clutching her reticule, and practically fled toward the cabin. Clement took his time with the mules, brushing them down and ensuring they had water and oats in the small barn he'd built against the mountain wall. He wanted to give her time to adjust, to realize exactly what she had signed up for. He hoisted her incredibly heavy trunk onto his shoulder, grunting at the weight. What on earth did she have in here? Bricks? He kicked the cabin door open and stopped dead in his tracks. The cabin was freezing. The cast-iron stove sat cold and dark in the corner. Genevieve was kneeling in front of it, her face streaked with black soot and tears of sheer frustration. The beautiful silk dress was ruined, covered in ash. She had a pile of kindling stacked inside, but she was helplessly striking matches against the iron, watching them flare and die before they could catch the wood. Clement set the trunk down with a heavy thud. Genevieve jumped, spinning around. Her emerald eyes were wide, filled with a humiliating mixture of defiance and defeat. The wood is damp," she lied, her voice trembling. Clement walked over, took the matchbox from her soot-stained, delicate hands, and looked inside the stove. She hadn't opened the flue. She had just stacked the wood tightly together, leaving no room for air. He didn't say a word. He reached up, twisted the iron handle of the flue, rearranged the kindling to allow a draft, and struck a single match. Within seconds, a warm, crackling orange glow illuminated the dim cabin. Genevieve stared at the flames, her shoulders slumping. "I lied," she said softly, staring at the fire. "I don't know how to cook. I don't know how to mend. I don't know how to do anything useful." Clement stood up, towering over her kneeling form. "I figured that out the second you stepped off the stage, Genevieve." "Then why did you bring me up here?" She looked up at him, the firelight dancing in her eyes. "Because a man's word means something up here, even if a woman's doesn't," Clement said harshly. He walked over to a small pantry, pulling out a slab of salt pork and a tin of beans. "You'll sleep in the bed tonight. I'll take the floor. Tomorrow, you start pulling your weight, or I take you back down the mountain. Whoever is chasing you be damned." Dinner was a silent, tense affair. Genevieve forced down the salty, tough meat, chewing mechanically. Every time a branch snapped outside in the wind, she flinched, her eyes darting to the heavy wooden door. After they ate, Clement pointed to a wash basin on the porch. "Wash up out there, I'll clear the table." As soon as she slipped out the door into the biting cold, Clement turned his attention back to the trunk. He had bumped it against the doorframe, carrying it in, and the heavy brass clasp had sprung loose. It wasn't locked. He told himself to mind his own business. But the weight of it, combined with her terror, gnawed at his survival instincts. He nudged the lid open with his boot. It wasn't filled with dresses. The top layer consisted of heavy velvet cloaks, but beneath them, neatly stacked, were thick, bound bundles of paper. Clement knelt, pulling one out. His breath caught in his throat. They were bearer bonds, United States Treasury bonds, and shares of the Union Pacific Railroad. He flipped through them, his mind doing the frantic math. 10,000, 20, there had to be close to $50,000 sitting in his cabin. But that wasn't what made the blood freeze in his veins. Resting atop the stacks of money was a small, pearl-handled Smith & Wesson Model 1.5 Derringer. Clement picked it up. He sniffed the barrel. The sharp, acrid scent of burnt black powder stung his nose. The gun had been fired recently, within the last few days. The cabin door creaked open, accompanied by a gust of freezing wind. Genevieve stood in the doorway, her face pale, shivering uncontrollably. She froze when she saw Clement kneeling by her open trunk, the Derringer resting lightly in his calloused hand. The silence in the room became absolute, heavier than the mountain stone outside. Clement slowly stood up, turning to face her. He tossed the small, silver gun onto the rough-hewn dining table with a loud clack. "So, Genevieve," Clement said, his voice dropping to a low, lethal whisper that carried the weight of a coming avalanche. "Care to tell me why a helpless widow from Philadelphia is carrying $50,000 in stolen railroad bonds and a gun that smells like murder?" The silence in the cabin was heavier than the snow beginning to pile against the thick window panes. Clement Montgomery stood still, the firelight catching the silver barrel of the Smith & Wesson and the jagged white scar on his jaw. He didn't yell. He didn't draw his own weapon. He just stared at her with the cold, assessing gaze of a man trying to calculate the trajectory of an incoming storm. Genevieve didn't shrink away. The initial terror that had gripped her at the Stagecoach station was gone, replaced by the cornered, dangerous energy of a trapped wolf. "I shot a man, Mr. Montgomery," she said, her voice eerily calm, though her hands still shook against the folds of her ruined silk skirt. "I don't know if he is dead, but I prayed to God he was before I boarded that stage in Chicago." Clement slowly placed the Derringer back on the table. He pulled out a heavy wooden chair and sat down, leaning his forearms on the rough timber. "Start talking. And God help you if you leave out a single detail. Whose money is this?" Genevieve swallowed hard. "It belongs to the Union Pacific Railroad. Specifically, to a man named Thomas Durant, and his financier, my husband, Cornelius Sterling." Clement's eyes narrowed. Even isolated in the high country, news of the railroad's eastward march and the sheer, brutal wealth it generated had reached Bitter Creek. Thomas Durant is a powerful man. He buys governors and judges the way other men buy a pint of ale. "You stole from him?" "I took what was stolen first," Genevieve shot back, stepping into the light of the stove. "Cornelius is a monster. He isn't building a nation, Clement. He's bleeding it dry. He and Durant set up a dummy corporation, the Crédit Mobilier. They are overcharging the government by millions of dollars to build the tracks, pocketing the taxpayer money, and forcibly running homesteaders off their land to secure the right-of-ways. Anyone who refuses to sell to their land company ends up dead, hanged by rustlers, or burned out in the night." She walked over to the trunk and reached beneath the velvet cloaks, pulling out a thick, leather-bound ledger. She dropped it on the table next to the gun. "The bonds are the capital. They were moving to a private account in San Francisco. But this," she tapped the ledger, "this is the proof of the fraud. The names of every congressman they bribed, every homesteader they had murdered, and the exact sums stolen. I found it in his study. When I tried to leave him, he locked me in our Philadelphia estate, said I was his property. I spent 6 months planning my escape." "And the gun?" Clement asked softly. "Cornelius sent his chief enforcer after me when he realized the ledger and the bonds were gone. A former Pinkerton detective named Gideon Locke. He cornered me in a Chicago hotel room. He was going to kill me and take the trunk back. I pulled that Derringer from my reticule and fired it into his chest. Then I ran, bought a ticket under a dead woman's name, Josephine Wright, and kept riding until the train tracks ended and the stagecoach took over." Clement looked at the stack of fortune, the ledger of sins, and the delicate woman standing before him. He had spent 4 years fighting a war over other men's greed in politics. He had come to the Wyoming Territory to wash his hands of the corrupted world, and now a $50,000 target had just walked into his sanctuary. "Locke is a Pinkerton?" Clement asked. Now he is Cornelius's private hound, and if he survived that bullet, he will not stop until he finds me." Clement ran a calloused hand over his face, listening to the wind howling fiercely outside. The storm had fully arrived, rattling the heavy log walls. He walked over to the window. The world outside was a swirling vortex of white. The temperature was plummeting toward 40 below zero. "Well," Clement said, his breath fogging the glass, "Gideon Locke might be a bloodhound, but he ain't God. Nobody is climbing this mountain in a blizzard. We're snowed in. Could be a week. Could be a month." Genevieve looked at him, her emerald eyes searching his weathered face. "Are you going to turn me over to them, Clement, when the thaw comes?" Clement turned around. He looked at her ruined silk dress, her soot-stained hands, and the fierce, desperate fire in her eyes. "I fought at Shiloh, Genevieve. I watched good men die for the profit of rich men sitting in parlors. I despise the railroad, and I despise men who beat women." He walked over and closed the heavy lid of the trunk. "You're safe here, but my rules still apply. If you're going to survive the winter in this cabin, that silk dress goes in the fire. Tomorrow, I teach you how to chop wood." The next 6 weeks were a brutal, unforgiving education. The Wyoming winter showed no mercy, and neither did Clement. Genevieve's delicate hands blistered, bled, and eventually formed thick yellow calluses from gripping the heavy iron-splitting maul. She learned to skin the rabbits Clement snared, fighting back nausea as she plunged her hands into the warm, bloody cavities to pull out the entrails. She learned to load and fire a heavy Winchester rifle, the recoil bruising her shoulder purple, until she could hit a pine cone at 50 yards. Clement watched the transformation with quiet, simmering respect. She never complained. When she failed, when the stew burned, or when she dropped a load of firewood in the snow, she simply gritted her teeth, marched back out into the freezing wind, and tried again. The icy chasm between them slowly began to thaw, replaced by the quiet intimacy of shared survival. In the evenings, by the glow of the cast-iron stove, the harsh mountain man and the refined city fugitive found common ground. Clement told her about the mountains, about the quiet majesty of the elk herds and the terrifying silence of a frozen river. Genevieve read to him from a worn volume of Shakespeare she had packed beneath the bonds, her soft, cultured voice filling the rough-hewn cabin with poetry that felt both alien and beautiful in the rugged wilderness. One evening, as she was bandaging a deep cut on Clement's palm from a slipped skinning knife, her fingers lingered against his rough skin. Clement looked down at her. Her auburn hair was tied back with a piece of twine, her face smudged with ash, wearing one of his oversized flannel shirts. She had never looked more breathtaking. He reached up, his thumb gently brushing a streak of dirt from her cheekbone. Genevieve's breath hitched. The air in the small cabin suddenly felt impossibly thick. She didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned into his touch, her eyes locking onto his. For a man who had sworn off the complexities of the world, the sudden, fierce urge to protect this woman terrified him more than any grizzly he had ever faced. He pulled his hand back, clearing his throat awkwardly. "You did a good job on the bandage," he muttered, standing up abruptly. "Storm's breaking tomorrow. I'm going to check the trap lines at first light." Genevieve watched him retreat to his pallet on the floor, a small, knowing smile playing on her lips. The mountain man was tough, but he wasn't made of stone. The thaw came fast and violent. The heavy snowpack began to melt, turning the mountain trails into treacherous rivers of freezing mud. The sun broke through the gray canopy for the first time in over a month, blindingly bright against the white peaks. Clement was 2 miles from the cabin, checking a snare line near a ridge that overlooked the valley, when he saw it. The mud was churned up, tracks, 5 horses, heavily burdened. Clement dropped to one knee, tracing the rim of a hoofprint with his bare finger. It was fresh, made within the hour. And more importantly, the horse was wearing factory-made steel horseshoes with a distinct eastern caulk, not the rough-forged iron shoes used by the locals in Bitter Creek. His blood ran cold. The mountain was empty this time of year. There was only one reason men with eastern horses would be riding up this treacherous grade. Gideon Locke had survived. And he had brought a posse. Clement didn't hesitate. He abandoned his furs, grabbed his Winchester, and sprinted back toward the cabin, his lungs burning in the thin mountain air. He navigated the treacherous, rocky shortcuts, cutting off the switchbacks the riders would have to take. He burst through the tree line just as the cabin came into view. Genevieve was on the porch, shaking out a heavy wool blanket. "Get inside!" Clement roared, his voice tearing through the quiet morning. Genevieve didn't ask questions. The sheer panic in his voice was enough. She dropped the blanket and darted inside. Clement slammed the heavy oak door shut behind them and dropped the massive iron bar into place. "What is it?" she asked, her face draining of color. "Riders. 5 of them." "Eastern horses," Clement said, moving frantically to the windows, pulling the heavy wooden shutters closed and latching them, leaving only small gaps to shoot through. "Locke found us." Genevieve moved toward her trunk. She didn't panic. The weeping woman from the stagecoach was gone. She pulled out the leather ledger, shoved it into a waterproof canvas sack, and then picked up her silver derringer. "They won't take me alive, Clement," she said, her voice like cold steel. "They ain't taking you at all," Clement replied, tossing her a Spencer repeating rifle from his rack. "Do you remember how to load that?" 7 rimfire cartridges in the tubular magazine in the stock," she recited, catching the heavy weapon. "Work the lever, aim for the center mass." "Good girl." The sound of churning mud and snorting horses echoed from the tree line. Clement peered through the crack in the shutter. 5 men rode into the clearing. 4 were rough-looking hired guns, wearing heavy dusters and carrying repeating rifles. But the man in the center made Genevieve gasp from across the room. He was a giant of a man, wearing a bowler hat and a tailored wool suit that looked utterly ridiculous in the Wyoming mud. He sat casually on a massive black gelding. Beneath his coat, a heavy bandage wrapped around his chest was visible, a testament to Genevieve's aim in Chicago. Clement Montgomery. Gideon Locke's voice boomed across the clearing, oily and arrogant. My name is Locke. I represent the Union Pacific Railroad. I believe you have a piece of stolen property in your cabin. I don't harbor thieves, Locke, Clement yelled back through the timber. Turn your horses around and ride back down the mountain before I start putting holes in you. Locke chuckled, lighting a cigar. Now, Clement, I know she's in there. I tracked her stage ticket to Bitter Creek, and Old Man Henderson was more than happy to point me up this trail for a $20 gold piece. She has $50,000 of Mr. Sterling's money. Send her out with the trunk, and I'll leave you $10,000 for your trouble. You can buy yourself a new mountain. Clement looked back at Genevieve. She was gripping the Spencer rifle, her knuckles white, her eyes locked on him. She was waiting to see if the mountain man could be bought. Clement spat on the floor. He shoved the barrel of his Winchester through the gap in the shutter. I don't take railroad money, Clement roared. He pulled the trigger. The Winchester barked, spitting a cloud of white smoke. The bullet slammed into the dirt an inch from Locke's horse, causing the massive beast to rear up in panic. Kill him! Locke screamed, struggling to control his horse. Burn the cabin if you have to. Just get the trunk. The clearing erupted in a deafening cacophony of gunfire. Heavy lead slugs slammed into the thick log walls of the cabin, showering the interior with splinters and dust. Clement fired back with lethal precision. He worked the lever of his Winchester smoothly, dropping one of the hired guns from his saddle with a shot to the chest. Genevieve moved to the side window. She rested the heavy barrel of the Spencer on the sill, took a deep breath, and squeezed the trigger. The recoil shoved her back, but the shot took the hat clean off another rider's head, sending him diving for cover behind a water trough. Keep them pinned. Clement yelled over the roar of gunpowder, but there were too many of them. 2 of the hired guns managed to flank the cabin, using the woodpile for cover. Bullets tore through the thin glass of the windows, shattering the jars of preserves in the pantry. Suddenly, a heavy thud shook the front door. One of the men had reached the porch with an axe. He swung violently, the steel biting deep into the oak. Clement cursed, drawing his Colt. 45. Cover the window, Genevieve. He rushed toward the door just as the axe blade smashed through the center panel, showering him in wood shards. Clement shoved his revolver into the jagged hole and fired twice. A scream echoed from the porch, and the heavy thud of a body hitting the floorboards followed. But the distraction cost him. The front shutter was blown entirely off its hinges by a shotgun blast from the woodpile. Clement spun around, but he was too slow. A heavy lead slug grazed his ribs, tearing through his flesh and knocking him backward to the hard dirt floor. He dropped his Colt, gasping for air as a burning agony ripped through his side. "Clement!" Genevieve screamed. Before she could run to him, the back door of the cabin burst open. Gideon Locke stood in the doorway, his bowler hat gone, a massive Navy Colt revolver in his hand. He stepped over the threshold, his eyes scanning the smoke-filled room. He saw Clement bleeding on the floor, and then his gaze locked onto Genevieve. A cruel, yellow-toothed smile spread across his face. "Hello, Mrs. Sterling," Locke hissed, raising his revolver toward Clement's head. "I told you I'd find you. Drop the rifle, or I blow his brains all over this floor." Genevieve froze. She looked at Clement, who was gripping his bleeding side, his eyes begging her to run. She slowly lowered the Spencer rifle, letting it clatter to the wooden planks. "Good girl," Locke sneered, stepping further into the room. "Now, where is the ledger?" Genevieve raised her hands in a gesture of surrender. But as she lifted her right hand, the oversized sleeve of Clement's flannel shirt slid down. Concealed perfectly in her palm was the silver Smith & Wesson Derringer. She didn't hesitate. She didn't warn him. From 3 feet away, Genevieve pulled the trigger. The tiny gun roared. The bullet caught Gideon Locke squarely in the throat. His cruel smile vanished, replaced by an expression of utter shock. He dropped his heavy revolver, clutching his neck as he staggered backward, crashing through the open doorway and collapsing into the freezing mud outside. Genevieve dropped the smoking derringer and ran to Clement, dropping to her knees beside him. She pressed her hands frantically against his bleeding side, her tears mixing with the blood and soot on his shirt. Clement groaned, a weak smile touching his lips, as he looked up at her terrified, beautiful face. "I told you," Clement wheezed, his voice barely a whisper. "You gotta aim for center mass." The crack of the derringer echoed against the mountain peaks, a sharp punctuation to the chaos. Outside, the surviving hired guns saw Gideon Locke hit the freezing mud, a dark pool spreading beneath his ruined throat. Without their paymaster, the remaining outlaws exchanged a panicked glance. Railroad money was good, but it wasn't worth dying for in the Absaroka dirt. They scrambled onto their eastern horses and spurred them hard down the treacherous, muddy switchbacks, abandoning the siege. Inside the smoke-filled cabin, the silence returned, thick and heavy with the metallic scent of blood and black powder. Genevieve ignored the fleeing riders. She tore a long strip from the ruined hem of her once immaculate silk skirt and pressed it fiercely against Clement's bleeding ribs. Her hands, once soft and unblemished, were now rough, calloused, and stained with soot, but they moved with desperate precision. "Stay with me, Clement," she ordered, her voice trembling but unbroken. "You do not get to die on me after teaching me how to gut a rabbit." Clement gritted his teeth, his head resting against the rough floorboards. He looked down at the wound. The lead slug had chewed through the meat of his side and shattered a rib, but it had missed his vitals. "Whiskey," he rasped, nodding toward the shelf. "And the sewing kit?" The following days were a blur of fever and agony. The high society wife from Philadelphia vanished entirely, replaced by a fierce mountain woman who chopped the firewood, kept the stove burning, and relentlessly tended to the wounded mountain man. She poured raw whiskey into his torn flesh without flinching, ignoring his pained curses, and stitched the wound closed with strong, even pulls of heavy black thread. When Clement finally woke a week later, clear-headed and ravenous, the spring thaw was in full effect. Sunlight streamed through the patched windows, catching the dust motes dancing in the warm air. Genevieve was sitting at the table, methodically cleaning the Spencer rifle. Clement pushed himself up on his good arm, groaning softly. "They'll send more, Genevieve," he said, his voice gravelly. "Thomas Durant and your husband have the funds to hire a private army. We can't hold them off forever." Genevieve set the cleaning rag down and walked over to the bed, carrying the heavy leather ledger. A cold, dangerous smile played on her lips, a smile that Clement realized he found incredibly intoxicating. "They won't send anyone, Clement, because by the time the snow clears the lower passes, Cornelius Sterling and Thomas Durant won't have the power to hire a stable boy." She opened the ledger. "We are not running. We are going to burn them to the ground. I am mailing this ledger to Charles A. Dana, the chief editor of the New York Sunday. He has been looking for concrete proof of the credit mobilier fraud for years. This book details every bribed congressman, every stolen federal dollar, and every homesteader Locke murdered for the right-of-ways." Clement stared at her, deeply impressed by her ruthless intellect. "And the $50,000 in bonds?" "We take it to Judge William Carter down in Fort Bridger," Genevieve stated, referencing the notoriously honest and fiercely independent Wyoming territorial judge. "He despises the Union Pacific brass. He can liquidate the bonds anonymously and distribute the funds to the families of the homesteaders Cornelius had killed. We keep nothing. Our hands remain entirely clean." "Leaving you a penniless widow," Clement pointed out, his dark eyes searching hers. Genevieve reached out, her fingers gently tracing the jagged white scar along Clement's jawline. "I was a prisoner in a mansion, Clement. Up here, chopping wood and smelling like pine resin. I am the wealthiest woman on earth." She leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a soft, husky whisper. "Besides, I believe we still have a contract. You advertised for a practical partner, a woman of strong constitution who could survive a winter and shoot straight." Clement let out a low, rumbling laugh that made his stitched ribs ache. He reached up with his good arm, pulling her down against his chest. He buried his face in her auburn hair, breathing in the scent of wood smoke, saddle leather, and the wild, untamed Wyoming spring. "Reckon I got exactly what I bargained for," Clement murmured, right before he kissed her. 6 months later, the nation was rocked by the greatest political scandal of the century. The New York Sun published the contents of the ledger, resulting in a wave of congressional indictments. Thomas Durant was disgraced, and Cornelius Sterling, facing federal prison for embezzlement and conspiracy to commit murder, fled the country, leaving Genevieve a legally free woman. Far above the noise of the crumbling railroad empires, in a sturdy cabin nestled high in the Absaroka pines, Mr. and Mrs. Montgomery paid the news no mind. They had firewood to chop, trap lines to check, and a long, quiet winter to look forward to. The telegram promised a sturdy widow, but the Wyoming mountains delivered a warrior in ruined silk. Clement and Genevieve forged a union not of convenience, but of fire, blood, and shared survival. Their love was a testament that sometimes the greatest truths are found hidden beneath the deadliest lies. In the untamed heart of the Absaroka Range, the mountain man and his runaway bride finally found their unbreakable peace.
Hi, my name is Ivy Duck Devotion, the owner and manager of Ivy Duck Devotion. After watching the video, That Can't Be My Bride, the mountain man stared as a stunning woman stepped off the stagecoach. I really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? What I enjoyed most about this story was the mix of surprise, uncertainty, and quiet hope between two people meeting under unexpected circumstances. Sometimes, life doesn't turn out the way we imagine, and that can be uncomfortable at first, but it can also open the door to something meaningful if we are willing to keep an open mind. Do you think the mountain man judged her too quickly when he first saw her, or was he simply overwhelmed by the moment? And if you were in his position, would you trust your first impression or take time to truly get to know someone? I think there's a small reminder in stories like this that people are often more complex than they seem on the surface. If this story put you in or gave you something to think about, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy mountain man stories filled with emotion, tension, and unexpected connections, feel free to like and subscribe only if you like to see more.